everyone, and welcome to today's Energy Resources Law Market Insight Seminar on the impact of China's global relationships on Australian energy and resource companies. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands in which we all meet today. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders of these lands, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So my name's Tamlyn Mills. I'm a partner in the dispute resolution team with Norton Fulbright, specialising in international arbitration and complex commercial litigation with a focus on the energy resource sector. And I'm delighted to be hosting this Market Insight seminar with guest speaker Cory Davie. Cory is a partner with Control Risks and heads the Asia Pacific team. In this role, Cory supports Australian companies as they look to enter new markets, strengthen their compliance and resilience, and manage critical business issues. Prior to joining the Sydney team, Cory was based in London, where she led the oil and gas sector for Europe and Africa, so she has a wealth of industry experience. Cory also has quite a unique and fascinating background, having worked in humanitarian operations in conflict and post-conflict environments, including Liberia, Darfur, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Iraq and Haiti, and that's not a complete list. So the topic of today's seminar is, as I said, the impact of China's global relationships on Australian energy and resource companies. And it's both a timely and relevant topic. I think as we've all seen, the headlines are dominated by China news, including tense and shifting geopolitical dynamics between China and the US and China and Australia. And private companies are not immune from the prevailing geopolitical landscape. It can impact on exports, foreign direct investment, supply chains, compliance and regulatory risk, just to mention a few. So what Cory will do today is help us to understand the current state of China's global relationships, what that means for Australian energy and resource companies, and provide some practical insights for how the sector can grapple with the challenges of operating in the current global context. If you've got any questions while Cory is talking, please feel free to enter them through the chat function, and we'll leave some time at the end to go through those. But without any further delay, I will hand over to Cory.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Tamlyn, and good morning. Thank you all very much for letting me come and speak to you today. I'm genuinely not sure there's an issue more regularly and breathlessly covered than China in Australia. And it's certainly one that I'm asked about constantly, either through clients or through speaking. So today I'm going to take you on a little bit of a whistle-stop tour. We're going to start with some of that big picture geopolitical, taking a look at Australia, China, but also we have to include the US in there because it is so relevant. Excuse me, then I'll dig into the role of regulation in China, which I think is a bigger driver than what it's given credit for in terms of some of the actions that we see. And then we'll look at some of the complicating factors from the Australia and the US side, so things like sanctions and investment restrictions. And I am going to try as much as possible to explain throughout how we see companies, and particularly resources companies, addressing these challenges, because otherwise I know it can feel a bit overwhelming. And so it's helpful to understand how some of these risks are addressed in real time. And obviously, as Tamlyn mentioned, have time at the end for any questions that you may have. So we'll jump straight into that geopolitical lens. So back at the start of the year, the question I was asked most was, were we going to see a kind of global de-escalation of the tensions with China? You know, with the departure of President Trump, there was hope that we might see a sort of dawn of a new era. And to be honest, our analysts at Control Risk didn't think that was going to be the case. Anti-China sentiment is probably one of the only truly bipartisan issues left in America. And indeed, that has proven to be correct. The Biden administration has continued to pursue a policy of containment, less bombastically than the Trump administration did, but I would say no less enthusiastically. Indeed, we put some analysis out last week on the run-up to the anniversary of, excuse me, of 9/11, and kind of Chinese interaction, Chinese containment has replaced terrorism as the sort of primary geopolitical foreign affairs issue of the US administration. And so both sides have solidified into a position that conflict, and I don't mean of the military kind necessarily, but the geopolitical kind, is inevitable. And I think more critically, the Trump era brought home to the Chinese government that they needed to accelerate the reduction of their reliance on the US. So we see much more use of the term self-reliance out of Beijing now. And that's a term that's often interpreted as anti-foreign, but actually it is a more nuanced concept. It's about creating resilience in their own economy and eliminating some of the critical points of failure that they had previously. And I do think it's worth taking a moment to consider why China today is perceived so differently from the China 15 years ago. I mean, the same CPC is in charge. So why, in Australia, did we celebrate Kevin Rudd speaking Mandarin all those years ago, but now we perceive the same country as a threat? And the truth is that both sides have changed, and it brings competition more out into the open. And I think particularly in the US and others, officials and politicians, even those who know China very well, have become quite frustrated with a lack of progress on bilateral trade issues. And also, and I think this is a critical issue, the hardening instead of liberalizing on human rights issues in China. There had been a sort of general view that as they moved forward in their capitalist journey, that they would liberalize and become more similar to the sort of Western concept of operations. And instead, we see them moving into a much more Chinese view of how they want to operate. And this has led to the shift in the US approach that we really saw come out under the Trump administration, but which is now here to stay. So what does that mean for Australia? Certainly it is true that our diplomatic contacts tell us the relations between the countries are about as bad as they've ever been. And you'll see this in the press, and we have it confirmed from our sources that they just can't get meetings with Chinese officials. And we've seen Beijing and Canberra trade these increasingly aggressive rhetorical kind of taunts and introduce formal and informal measures that discourage bilateral trade and investment. And there isn't really a release valve in sight for the tensions right now, particularly with federal elections required here in Australia by 2022. There's not really an incentive for Australian politicians to back down on this rhetoric. I think much like the US, there's not a lot of votes in Middle Australia for being seen to be soft on China. But I think the thing to understand is, while it doesn't always seem that way in the press, things aren't actually deteriorating massively from the already low point that we find ourselves sitting at. Responses have actually tended to be relatively proportionate. It's what I would call more of a tit for tat. So if we take an example, last year we had the canceling by the Australian government of the Belt and Road Initiative agreements that had been signed by the Victorian state. And that then led to the subsequent cancellation by the Chinese of the China-Australia Economic Dialogue. So these were both quite high profile things, but honestly, they were pretty low impact. The Belt and Road Initiative deals hadn't really started moving. The China-Australia Economic Dialogue hadn't been used for a number of years. So that's an example of a situation which is actually being held at a fairly low simmer. Now, we've had conversations with our sources in Canberra, and they confirm that the Aussie government is reviewing other government-backed deals. And so future cancellations of government-to-government agreements are potentially could happen, and those are likely to result in more informal trade restrictions for Australian exports. I think the real escalation point here will be if commercial deals are targeted by the Aussie government. And our sources tell us that is on the table. So if that happens, we can expect to see China potentially quite escalate their response. So I would recommend keeping an eye on the review of the Darwin port contract as a real bellwether for this potential escalation. So barring that escalation, The use of trade sanctions to disrupt imports and the sale of Australian products in China will be the primary tool that we continue to see China using. What that means for Australian businesses is, and I think for you as legal counsels, first and foremost, that compliance matters more than ever on both sides. And let me dig into what I mean a bit more about this on the Chinese side. So 2021 has seen a really big regulatory push. It's mostly impacted domestic businesses in China so far, but it's creating a lot of concern in the wider business community. When you get this sort of intense regulatory enforcement, it can make China feel unstable or irrational, but actually the enforcement is grounded in existing policy goals. Although this year it should be said that that enforcement has been given a sort of populist makeover. And what that makeover is, you'll hear a lot of statements, and I actually saw an opinion piece in one of the newspapers today about common prosperity. And what common prosperity is this sort of populist idea that businesses shouldn't be getting rich if all Chinese people are not getting rich. And so it's being interpreted as being anti-business. But the thing is, Beijing wants the private sector to thrive, but they want it to thrive not at the expense of their commitments to the wider population to create their view of a fairer and more just market. And so what they're doing is they're using regulation to force this operating environment that they want into being. And this is a long-term trend. We've been seeing this since 2014. It started back with the big anti-corruption drive that some of you may remember. Then it moved into antitrust, cyber and data regulation, which is a whole different talk that we could do. And now there's also this renewed push on environment and healthcare. So the regulatory developments that we've been seeing in 2021, they should be viewed as the latest phase in this long-term trend. The way I see them often being covered, though, is this kind of one monolithic crackdown that suddenly appeared in 2021, and it's being driven by political antipathy to business, which is when everyone points to this sort of common prosperity, and everything is being done at the specific requirement of the sort of omnipotent power of President Xi. But we believe this is misleading. Definitely top-level political impetus drives key trends, but when you break it down and you look at it, there are specific policy goals and industry dynamics which are being met with this crackdown. And so therefore regulation starts to look less arbitrary and it becomes a bit more predictable. And I think a lot of the uncertainty that some businesses, both Chinese and international, are feeling right now comes not from arbitrary attacks on business, but because in many cases, enforcement is involving relatively new issues. It does involve commercial dynamics, new commercial dynamics. It involves new regulations and indeed entirely new regulators. And the best example of that is cyber and data, where we're seeing a whole new regulatory ecosystem emerge that everyone's trying to figure out how to navigate at the same time. So specifically for your sector and the resources sector, it has not been a primary target of enforcement in this latest round, in part because it actually already has seen a lot of enforcement during some of these previous waves when we saw environmental, health and safety, anti-corruption, and commercial secrets enforcement. And just to be clear, it doesn't mean that resources might not be in the firing line again, and particularly when companies in the industry are viewed as profiting to China's disadvantage. So that means compliance violations are going to become extremely risk amplifying in the context of sky-high resource prices. So any commercial bribery or anti-competitive behavior, which is viewed as contributing to high prices that slow down China's economic growth, that's likely to be penalized far more aggressively than you might otherwise expect. So I think the 2 points I would leave you with on this China regulation side are first, you need to get into the weeds of your particular space. You need to look at what is happening with your Chinese peers and other multinational peers. You need to look at what strategic language is coming out of Beijing about your sector. And then you'll get a much better view on where you are likely to be targeted. The second point I would make is being careful not to ascribe geopolitical motivations to regulatory driven decisions. And I'll give you a couple examples what I mean about this. So a few weeks ago, China cut down inbound international flights, and there was lots of rhetoric blaming geopolitical tensions and headlines about airlines being used as pawns in this big game of diplomatic chess. And actually, the answer was very simple. China was enforcing a clearly stated COVID restriction, and they had been very upfront that they were going to put that first. And so I think people had looked at this as being a sort of, because it was mostly American airlines that were being impacted, and it was, example of deteriorating relationship between the two countries. Actually, it was exactly what it said on the tin. And I would actually put the restrictions on Australian coal in the same bucket. When that happened, there was lots of noise about this being political punishment to Australia specifically, but actually it was much more to do with environmental and localization priorities. And other countries were caught up in it as well. Russia had the exact same problems, but because there wasn't that wider geopolitical narrative, they didn't get the same airtime. And I think where it becomes dangerous to ascribe these geopolitical reasons when there's a regulatory one is that you can actually miss what you need to do to fix it. And the final example I'll give is over the past couple of years, factory managers at foreign firms have been claiming political targeting when they were shut down over pollution violations. But in most cases, it was actually just poor management. They should have upgraded their scrubbers years ago, but by blaming politics, they were able to say, well, this is something we can't do anything about, when in fact, there were actually very specific compliance-driven actions they could have taken. So if we flip this around and we take a look at what this looks like on the Australian side, there's a lot of different angles, but there's two things I wanted to focus on with you guys today. The first is looking at supply chain, and then we'll have a quick look at inward Chinese investment into Australia as well. So supply chain issues with China have become unbelievably complex in the past 3 years or so, particularly for those with any US exposure. But I think most of us these days do have it. Easy for me to say I'm an American, but given financial markets and everything else. So we saw the US government first on national security grounds, restricting certain Chinese hardware providers and other tech companies. And so that was sort of the first salvo. And then last year, US sanctions began to be introduced on human rights grounds to do with certain regions of China. So Chinese companies who are directly involved in these regions, but also who have subsidiaries who find themselves sanctioned. And that's hit a number of our clients, sometimes mid-project, when they suddenly find themselves getting caught up. And it is important to note, I'm sure most of you are aware, that Australia is looking at amending the Autonomous Sanctions Act to allow them to place sanctions for human rights reasons as well. So Australian firms who have so far managed to avoid the US sanctions regime could find themselves needing to take a look at this. They could find Australian sanctions being placed on Chinese entities similar to those introduced by the US. Now, if you're going to add another layer of complication to this, earlier this year, China passed the anti-foreign sanctions law, and that prohibits companies from complying with what they call unreasonable foreign sanctions on Chinese entities. So basically, you're being put between a rock and a hard place, right? Either you're obeying US sanctions or EU sanctions, or you are obeying Chinese law, but it is impossible to comply with both. So what that means is the easiest option is just not to have the relationships in the first place, or to have identified them and ended them for business-driven reasons before those sanctions are in place. So it makes it unbelievably critical to have a risk-based approach to monitoring the entirety of your supply chain. You need to understand where your supply chain runs through, I mean, geographically, and what industries and types of products are most likely to face sanctions from the US or the EU or Australia, or other restrictions indeed, and then really be rigorous all the way down your supply chain in identifying those risks. So moving from supply chains to inward Chinese investment, that has been politicized by Australian regulation in some cases, both through the FIRB and through critical strategic infrastructure regulation. I'm sure many of you will remember in, I think it was August last year, when Treasurer Frydenberg rejected the sale of an Australian company to a Chinese dairy manufacturer. And that deal had actually passed FIRB review. And there were concerns that this was the beginning of a sort of freeze on any inward investment of Chinese capital into Australia. I mean, in fact, we are still seeing Chinese deals happening here in the resources sector and elsewhere. I've worked with a number of clients who have either brought in investment or looking at joint ventures with Chinese and Hong Kong-based companies. What is interesting is I am hearing anecdotally of some self-censoring. So Chinese and Hong Kong owned companies who are actually taking themselves out of the running for big projects in Australia because they're assuming that the review process will be too onerous. And I think, you know, the higher profile the deal, the bigger the risk that there is going to be some political involvement. And so, you know, anything involving key sectors like infrastructure, education, food security, sensitive tech like AI. But I also think the other issue to consider here is a reputational one. There is a very real reputational risk in Australia for companies who are too closely associated with China. Some of you may remember at the end of last year on social media, there were these lists of companies circulating who were linked to China, either through parent companies or investors, and consumers were being encouraged to boycott them. And this has died down for the moment, but again, elections on the horizon, I think it could start to reappear. So just wrap up quickly, given all these factors, bearing in mind that I've only scratched the surface, I know it can seem like fine, operations in China, just not worth the risk. But I would say, first of all, I'm not sure that's actually an option for many Australian businesses. There's no other customer or potential partner who's as big or as present in our region and the world. And certainly if our workload at Control Risk is anything to go by, companies have not stopped looking to engage with China. So the first and best thing I would say is you need to understand very clearly, again, the space you occupy in relation to China. Think of them as your customer, as your supplier, as your investor, whatever it might be, and then figure out the specific risks to you. Because if you don't have a filter, this fire hose of negative headlines, it just gets completely overwhelming. And then you risk either overreacting to everything or just ignoring it. And then you miss a genuine escalation trigger that you do need to react to. And we actually work closely with a number of companies to kind of figure out their specific triggers and then, but more importantly, how to monitor them. How can you figure out when, when the rhetoric coming out of Beijing increases or changes? Once you have that clarity, it's then much easier to kind of tune out the rest of the noise or to be able to read it with a much more critical eye. All right, so I'm very conscious of time. I've only scratched the surface, but very happy to take questions that you may have. I just need to caveat, I am by no means an expert, but I'm very lucky to sit on top of a team of fantastic experts. So if there's anything that I can't answer myself, I will absolutely commit to going away and getting a fuller answer for you. Tamlyn, I'll hand back across to you.
Thanks so much, Cory. That was really fascinating and interesting and useful, I think, to be able to step behind the headlines and the rhetoric and sort of demystify what is actually going on and what companies can proactively and do to get on top of that risk and to manage it. Please, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat box, but perhaps to get started. Cory, we've seen Australian politicians kind of pivoting away from China and then looking elsewhere. So I think there have been meetings recently with India. There's been a focus on Indonesia and Japan, and strengthening those other bilateral relationships within the Asia Pacific region. Do you see sort of in the medium or long term that there'll be a similar kind of pivoting away from China in the commercial space, that companies will look to strengthen other markets in place of China to manage risk?
Absolutely. And I think, that's certainly what the government is encouraging. I mean, Treasurer Feinberg has his China Plus is the concept that he uses around this. And I think the nuance in that China Plus is good in that it's not black and white. And I think having, to use a very cliched thing, all your eggs in one basket is never a good thing. And COVID taught us that, right? When COVID first struck at the start of 2020, and I was working with so many clients who suddenly realized very key parts of their operations only existed in China. Key elements they needed only existed in China. And when the whole country shut down, they had no way to replace it in their supply chain. And so I think that resilience is critical. And I would encourage any business not to have everything sit with one customer, with one market. I think what is less likely to me is I've heard some talk of, okay, we're going to replace China. So go to Indonesia or India or Vietnam or whatever it is. And, back to what I said a moment ago, China is irreplaceable in some ways just because of the scale of it. It's just that you're not going to achieve that scale anywhere else. And it's not like India or Indonesia or Vietnam or any of these places are easy places to operate. And so it takes a lot of time to build up an understanding of the operational environment in any of these jurisdictions. And so it's not something you can do on a dime. So I think if we look 5-10 years down the road, I do think that we will see a more diverse kind of palette of countries that Australian companies are working with. But, if I had to put my money on it, I would say that China's still going to be well at the top of that list.
Great. And we have had a question come through around the risk of involvement with Taiwan, given the political tensions around that. I'm conscious this is being recorded and there might be things that you can't say or touch on, but are you able to respond to that comment at all?
So I'll give a couple thoughts on that. First, I think, then thank you very much for the question. I think the first thing I want to talk about is the risk of a military engagement. And it's something that I get a lot of questions about. I think The Economist had a headline about big war, and we've had obviously former intelligence officials and security officials here in Australia talking about it. An ex-Malaysian president recently said something about Australian involvement with the Quad was increasing the likelihood of war. And we spend a lot of time thinking about this and what likelihood we think there is. And we still feel that the likelihood of an all-out military conflict is exceptionally low because the cost-benefit analysis is just not in anyone's interest. And I don't know if any of you caught this morning, actually, there was an article, Bob Woodward has a new book out, and it was talking about how at the end of the Trump administration, US military officials were going behind him to speak to their counterparts in China to specifically say, please believe us, there is no military anything happening. They stopped doing some planned exercises in the South China Sea, so there was no chance China could misinterpret anything. So I think everyone is very conscious that a military conflict is not in anyone's interest. And China is conscious of that as well, regardless of what I think some of the opinion that we see in the press. Now, I will cautiously tiptoe around the issue of Taiwan is an incredibly difficult one. And I am aware of companies who have found themselves in very difficult situations because of labeling on internal logistics platforms and things like that. But what I would also point out is that the economic relationship between Taipei and Beijing is actually quite strong. And there's a strong flow of human capital and intelligence. And so I think it is the words that you use matter greatly in this context, and being very cautious about the words. And I'm being, excuse me for being a little bit purposefully vague, but in terms of the actual ability to operate, I think it absolutely is still possible. And in terms of the risk of getting caught up in a military conflict, I would currently rate that as exceptionally low, but you'll hear a lot of noise about it.
Great, thank you, Cory. We don't have any other questions, and we are just over our allocated half an hour for these short and sweet market insight seminars. But thank you so much for your time today. That's, as you said, we've just scratched the surface. I'm sure there's lots more we could talk about, but we really appreciate your insights. So thank you very much, Cory.
Thank you all so much for joining. Thanks.